Chauntasia Gardner was born on May the 11th, 2009. Her mother was Tivasha Logan, who was 25 years old. Her father was Chauncey Gardner, who was 27. In the house lived 5 children in total. Tivasha had 2 additional children who resided elsewhere. Chauntasia was the couple's 4th child together. She was born 10 weeks premature. Although the infant initially had some trouble with bottle feeding, she thrived in the hospital neonatal unit and was discharged to the care of her mother at the end of July 2009. This story is regarding Tivasha, the child, and the father, Chauncey. After this, I have the case of Alice Crimmins, so please stay tuned for that one. Chauntasia was to receive a high-calorie formula that could only be obtained with a prescription, and arrangements were made for the mother to obtain the formula without charge. Hospital staff also helped the mother make an appointment with a physician following the infant's discharge. Chauncey's involvement with the child was less than the mother's because his relationship with Tivasha was unstable. Now, on November 1st, 2009 at 6 a.m., police arrived at their home. They lived on 2710 Sunshine Drive in North Lakeland, Florida. They were responding to a 5-month-old child who was not breathing. Detectives described seeing the fridge and cupboards with food and drinks. However, only a single partially filled can of baby formula was found in the home. When asked about her feeding, the parents told deputies the baby was receiving 2 ounces of formula every 3 hours or so. The directions on the formula can found in the residence recommended the formula be mixed with water in equal parts. However, Tivasha and Chauncey told detectives they mixed 1 ounce of water with 1 ounce of formula. But upon questioning further, the police realized that the baby was receiving 1/3 of the recommended amount of formula at each feeding. In other words, it was watered down formula. More water, less powder. Unfortunately, at this moment, the child was pronounced dead by the EMS at the residence. The child was observed on the floor wearing a pink shirt and white diapers. It was immediately noticed she was emaciated and appeared in a malnourished condition. The child's jaw bones were easily visible and her eyes had the appearance they were sunken. The area of her abdomen was also sunken. Her skin had a loose and wrinkly appearance. However, the police did confirm that the residence was well kept. The fridge and cupboards were well stocked with food and drinks for older children and adults. Now, during the police interview with Tivasha, she stated that Chauntasia was born premature. The child was brought home where she and Chauncey shared the responsibility of caring for the infant. She said they fed her baby formula every 3 hours. She did confirm she didn't read the directions on the formula on each feed. Tivasha did confirm though that the child wasn't sick or had any problems since being released from hospital and had not seen the doctor since. She did though at times try to get several appointments with the doctor but was unsuccessful because no doctor or doctor's office would accept Chauntasia's form of Medicaid. She did say that she is receiving SSI benefits and she's also on food stamps. Now, in terms of her observations, she said she first noticed Chauntasia losing weight and was skinny a few days before. But she didn't think anything of it because Chauntasia was always that skinny. The child weighed 7 to 8 pounds when she left the hospital, and when she was weighed at the health department in August, she had gained 2 pounds. On the day of her passing, Tivasha at 5 a.m. found the infant unresponsive. She noticed her bones were sticking out of her face. When she noticed that she was losing weight, Tivasha reiterated she didn't think anything of it. Police then spoke to the wider family. You had Vonda Stewart, who is Tivasha's mother and Chauntasia's grandmother. She told police she confronted Tivasha 2 weeks prior and told her that the infant needed to be seen by a doctor because of her weight. When police questioned Tivasha about this, she admitted that she lied to her mother because her mother kept hounding her about the child needing to see a doctor. She said she told her mother that the girl weighed 8 pounds when in fact she didn't. Then admitted that she noticed that Chauntasia was losing a lot of weight approximately 2 weeks before her death, but she was scared that she was going to get in trouble. Of course, she knew she was barely giving the child formula and she did not want to get caught. She knew that she could and should have taken her to the hospital, but again, the staff would notify the Department of Children and Families that this child is being underfed, pay attention to the family, something might be going on. As for Chauncey himself, when he was questioned, he told the police there's nothing wrong with the child and that from the moment she left the hospital to the moment she died, she seemed the same. He did say maybe she lost some weight leading up to her death, but it wasn't that big of a deal. She did feel a little lighter when he held her, but did confirm that he and Tivasha fed the child properly. As for him, he was not present in the home for most of the last 2 months. Tivasha kicked him out of her home 2 weeks after she brought the infant home from the hospital. Chauncey then moved in with his sister and never returned to live with Tivasha and the children. He would visit every now and then. Each time he would stay for perhaps 20 minutes for less than an hour. He did not feed or bathe the children. Do you think he's culpable? Let me know. As for the autopsy of the child, it was performed by Dr. Stephen Nelson. He identified there was a small amount of a thin, watery fluid in the child's stomach. There were no feces in the small bowel, but only a paste-like substance in her colon. The child weighed 6 pounds at the time of the autopsy. Now, the national average of babies at 5 months, their weight is 15 pounds. Dr. Nelson also related the average length of 5-month-old children at 64 centimeters head to heel. Chauntasia was 56. The measurements correspond to less than 1 percentile of children this age. This meant that 99% of children who are 5 months old weighed more than Chauntasia and were longer. Wow. Watered down formula, you moron. Of course, remember the pantry, full of juice, pasta, snacks, canned food. Plenty to fill the bellies of adults and older children, but not enough to feed an infant baby. The police who worked on this case found the whole thing mind-boggling. The sheriff told reporters, "I've done this job my entire life. I've seen a lot of violence against children and babies, but I can't remember seeing one starve to death. This child was tortured for days until she finally died from starvation. I mean, the family even lived a mile from the nearest grocery store and was in walking distance of 2 churches. Tivasha had Medicaid and received Social Security income and food stamps. She also participated in the county's Women, Infants and Children program, which provided some formula. At the residence, investigators even found a $600 Social Security check that she received specifically for the infant. But again, they realized that Tivasha watered down the formula at a 3-to-1 ratio, not as the 1-and-1 label instructed. So for those that have children, right, you'll know what I mean. You get the packet of formula, then you get the little spoon that comes with it. Normally, it's 1 spoon for 1 ounce, right? And then if you're going to give them 4 ounces, of the formula, 4 spoons, it's 4 ounces of water, right? Sometimes you'll have a spoon that's 2 ounces. So again, you configure the ratio. But in other words, to put it simply, 1 spoon, 3 water. That's what she did. The baby's going to be starving at that age. Silly cow. In fact, both Tivasha and Gardner had been investigated 4 times in the past between 2000 and 2007. Sometimes there were indicators of inadequate supervision and other times there weren't, but there was never enough evidence to removing children from the home. They both had each previously been convicted of several crimes. Chauncey Gardner's convictions included possession of cocaine and driving under the influence. Tivasha included driving under the influence and resisting arrest. So eventually the couple were arrested for the death of Chauntasia. The sheriff's office accused the couple of feeding their daughter so little that she died. In the trial, jurors deliberated and decided Tivasha was guilty of starving her infant to death. At the trial, she clutched a pink Bible and wept as the decision was announced in the courtroom. She sobbed as jurors took turns verifying that each had reached the same conclusion, that she was guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter of a child. Circuit Judge Donald Jacobson asked her whether she wanted to say anything before he imposed her punishment. Sniffling with tears in her eyes, she shook her head slightly. Tivasha was sentenced to life in prison. As for Chauncey, well, the dilemma was he was barely in the house. Should he be punished? But he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Watered down formula. How selfish is that? She obviously took the money and spent it on something else. Feeding her own belly, it seems like. You ever seen a child cry? My daughter, she's 1 year old now. Obviously, she's been drinking formula for the past year, but when she's hungry, she cries. And I have a son as well. Girls' cries are a bit more intense. They're louder, but they're a bit more intense. So you kind of feel it a bit more, if that makes sense. 3-to-1 ratio. Life is the least you deserve. Now I'm going to move on to the case of Alice Crimmins. This is a very confusing case, so please stick with me. So on the morning of July the 14th, 1965, Eddie Crimmins received a telephone call from his wife Alice. She accused him of having taken the children. You see, the couple at the time were going through a divorce. She had opened their bedroom door and she had seen that the beds had been slept in. However, Eddie Jr., who was 5, and his 4-year-old sister Alice were gone. Alice Marie, the daughter of Alice, was also referred to as Missy, so I'm going to use the term Missy to avoid confusion. Eddie himself, the father, was an airplane mechanic who worked nights. He said he knew nothing of the children's whereabouts and said he would come home to see her. Jerry Peering, who was the first detective to arrive, he took one look at Alice and think this is not the picture of an anxious mother. He looked through the garbage cans and there were about a dozen empty liquor bottles that Alice later attributed to good housekeeping rather than overindulgence. The police detective Peering took Alice into her bedroom and questioned her about her activities on that day. She said between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, she and the children had a picnic. They came home after the picnic to pick up food for dinner. After dinner, Alice took the children for a ride. You see, she wanted to find out the location of an apartment to which Eddie, the husband, recently moved into. She believed Eddie had planted a bug on her phone, so she was hoping to retaliate by finding him with another woman. What the hell kind of dynamic is that? So she took the children in the car and she drove around for more than an hour until it was dark looking for this apartment. Upon returning home, Alice prepared the children for bed at 9 p.m. At midnight, she took Eddie Jr. to the bathroom but could not wake Missy. Afterwards, Alice took the dog for a walk, then sat on the front stoop for a while. She told Peering that she may not have bolted the front door at the time. When she was getting ready for bed, her husband called and angered her by repeating that she owes money to the maid, you need to pay the maid. Alice calmed down by taking the dog out again for a walk and then went to sleep around 4 a.m. So then in the early afternoon of July the 14th, this is what she did. So with all of this, the police then considered their home a crime scene. They looked at the situation as a homicide. Then, a 9-year-old boy called Jay Silverman, he found Missy's body in an open lot on 162nd Street. A pajama top was loosely tied around her bruised neck. An autopsy performed by Dr. Milton Halpern, who was New York Chief Medical Examiner, found no evidence of sexual assault. There were hemorrhages in the mucous membrane in the throat and vocal cords confirmed that Missy had been asphyxiated. The contents of the stomach was sent to an expert who reported finding a macaroni-like substance, and this discovery rang a bell with Detective Peering. Alice told him that she had fed the kids some manicotti and he saw a slice of the same in the fridge and a box of frozen manicotti in the trash. However, this Detective Peering, right, he didn't take any photographs or anything, so he didn't have any evidence per se. Now, when Alice talked to other detectives, she said that the kids had eaten veal that night. As time went on, the Monday morning, July 19th, Eddie Jr.'s body was found on an embankment overlooking the Van Wyck Expressway. His body was eaten away by rats and insects in an advanced state of decay. The site was about a mile from Alice's apartment. After the children were buried, Alice and her husband, reunited by their tragedy, faced a relentless police investigation which explored many trails, always leading back to Alice. See, at first, Eddie had been more inclined to cooperate with the police than Alice. He submitted a lie detector test and he told Alice, you should do one too. However, after she agreed and the preliminary questions were completed, she refused to continue. The police then decided to forget about Eddie and concentrated on Alice. Now, before the couple moved into a new 3-room apartment in Queens to avoid the eyes of the public, the police succeeded to the role long played by Alice's jealous husband. They planted ultra-sensitive microphone and tapped the telephone wires. Detectives monitored the apartment around the clock from the 3rd floor pharmacy of a neighboring hospital, but could not pick up any single incriminating statements. The secret listeners were tuned into the sounds of Alice's sexual encounters. Cheeky minx, which resumed shortly after she took up her new residence. According to police investigators, they vented their hostility against Alice by interfering with the love affairs that they were recording. The police overheard Joe Rorak, who was a lover of Alice. They overheard them making love. So they went and told Eddie, who promptly called her, and she said, no, I'm in the house by myself. This investigation dragged on for 1.5 years without result. But then, on September 1st, 1967, Assistant District Attorney James Mosley went to a grand jury to present the testimony of a mystery witness. This witness was identified as Sophie Iromersky. Sophie's original entrance into the case had been anonymous. She reported an incident she had witnessed while looking out of her living room on the early morning of July 14, 1965. She sent a letter to police, and this letter stated she saw a lady resembling Alice who was carrying a bundle of blankets. James Mosley came across Sophie's letter, and the hunt began to find her. The police obtained samples of the handwriting of tenants living in the garden apartment, from which the scene described in the letter could have been viewed, to which they identified Sophie, who recognized Alice's photograph as resembling the woman she had seen. Sophie's testimony before the grand jury was decisive. The Queen's County finally had its long-coveted indictment, charging Alice with the murder of Missy. The prosecution had persuaded the grand jury that there was reasonable cause to believe that the bundle of blankets Sophie had seen contained the little girl's dead body. So on May 9, 1968, the trial began. The forensic expert testified that the discovery of as much food as was found in Missy's stomach was consistent with the post-ingestion period of less than 2 hours. Joe, one of Alice's lovers, he also testified. He said she did not want Eddie to have the children. She would rather see the children dead than Eddie have them. She told him, "The children will understand. They will know it's for the best. Please forgive me. I killed her." These were the words Alice relayed to Joe. So after Joe's damning testimony and the appearance of Sophie, the defense tried to destroy Sophie's credibility, but it didn't work. The trial ended after 13 days on Monday, May 27th, and early the next morning, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter. Imagine that back then, one letter and one witness, no crime scene photos, nothing, and you're guilty. I'm not excusing her, but still, a bit weird, innit? So, after her sentencing hearing, Alice protested her innocence and angrily told the judge, "You don't care about who killed my children, you want to close your books, you don't give a damn." The judge sentenced her for 20 years. Now in March 1971, a retrial began. As Alice's first jury had found her guilty of manslaughter in the death of Missy, principles of double jeopardy prohibited her from being charged with a greater offense against her daughter. But the prosecution had compensated for that limitation by obtaining an additional indictment for the murder of young Eddie, though the state of his remains ruled out proof of cause of death. The prosecution showed the evidence of Dr. Milton Halpern that murder could be inferred because of the circumstances of his sister's death. Well, she died and Alice did it, so he died and Alice probably did it. Going back to Alice's lover, Joe, he then adapted his testimony to the new prosecution's design. According to his revised story, Alice had told him that she took Missy's life and consented to the murder of her son. The prosecution also presented a new witness. You had Mrs. Tina DeVita, a resident of the Kew Garden Hills development at the time of the crime. She testified that on the night of July 13, while driving home with her husband, she looked out of the driver's window from the passenger side. She had seen people walking, a man carrying a bundle, a woman, a dog, and a boy. See, the defense had a witness of their own, Vincent Colabella. He was a jail gangster who had reportedly admitted to a fellow prisoner that he was the one that took Eddie Jr.'s life, only to deny that report when questioned by the police. On the stand, he chuckled as he disowned any knowledge of the crime. He said he had never seen Alice before. Clearly, this gangster just went there for the fame. Or maybe he wanted to get out of prison for a day. Now, in their closing argument, the defense cited Sophie's testimony that she had been led to tell her story by the voices of children crying from the grave. If they were crying, they were saying, "Let my mother go, you've had her long enough." The jury deliberations began after lunch on Thursday, April 23rd and ended at 6 p.m. the following day. Alice was found guilty of murder in the first degree regarding the death of her son. She was then remanded to Bedford Hills Prison, and there she stayed for 2 years while her lawyers continued the battle for her freedom in the appeal courts. Now in May 1973, the appeal division ruled for a second time in her favor. The court threw out the murder conviction on the grounds that the state had not proved beyond reasonable doubt that young Eddie's death had resulted from a criminal act. With respect to the manslaughter count relating to Missy, the court ordered a new trial on the basis of a number of errors, including the prosecutor's comment that Alice lacked the courage to admit to the killing. This argument amounted to an improper assertion that the prosecutor knew her to be guilty, and in addition was an improper attack on her refusal to testify. Alice was freed from prison following this ruling. Now, regardless of what you think of Alice, right, At this moment, they really had no evidence. All they had was a witness through a car window, a witness through a house window, and some ex-lover. No crime scene photos, no like the bugging of her house. They had nothing. Now, in February 1975, the Court of Appeals announced its decision relating to the verdicts in the second trial. It agreed with the dismissal of the murder charge. Furthermore, the Court of Appeals conceded that the prosecution's comment on Alice's refusal to testify on the second trial violated her constitutional privilege against self-incrimination. But the court decided that the constitutional error was harmless in view of the weighty evidence of Alice's guilt. So they then confirmed the manslaughter conviction originally levied. So Alice was once again sent back to prison to continue serving her sentence of 20 years. But her defense still had one card to play. He had newly discovered evidence. There was a witness, an electronic scientist named Sutherland Macklem. See, according to him, shortly after 1 o'clock on the morning of July 14th, 1965, he had picked up two small children, a boy and a girl, hitchhiking in Queens County. Which 5-year-olds are hitchhiking? What? The boy had told him that he knew where his home was, and Macklem had let them out safe and sound from his car on the corner of 162nd Street. He, however, did not learn the children's names, but stated that the boy could well have identified his companion as Missy instead of my sister, as he had first thought. He admitted that he had identified his passengers as Alice's children, but he did admit he only realized these were Alice's children after reading the newspaper accounts of the trial 3 years later. But the court rejected this witness, saying, "This was 3 or 4 years ago. Why are you coming to us now? See you later." Now, while in prison in 1976, Alice became eligible for a work release program and was permitted to leave prison 1 weekdays to work as a secretary. In 1977, the New York Post reported that Alice has spent the previous Sunday, as she has spent many summer Sundays of her prison term, on a luxury city island cruiser. Later in 1977, Alice married the proprietor of the luxury cruiser, her contractor boyfriend Anthony Grace. And then, of September that year, in 77, Alice was granted parole after 30 months in prison and 9 months in the work release program. Now, what you need to take into consideration is that, again, the Detective Peering, did not take notes or photographs of the crime scene when he initially went to her home. And then, when the word came in that Missy was found, her body was found, the detectives took Alice to the scene without telling her where they were going, because they wanted to study her reaction in real time. She fainted when she saw Missy, but did not cry on the ride home, at least not until the cameras started snapping pictures and her silent shock turned into hysterics. And it was several days later when Eddie Jr.'s body was found where she showed more emotion. You see, at the time, to the press, Alice was described as a sex pot, a sexy redhead. She was seen clubbing and hooking up with other men just days after her children were found. The police did find these actions suspicious, but you could argue, well, maybe she's using this as a way to get over the grief. Throughout this period, the police also followed and harassed Alice, even though she looked for work under a different name. Her notoriety followed her, causing her to lose several jobs. Alice's phones were tapped, which she soon figured out. In fact, one time, she picked up the phone and said, "Hi boys," drop dead, knowing the police are listening. It's also important to note that Alice was never presumed innocent. She had been found guilty by the press and public long before she even went to trial, and many observers believed that she was on trial for her sexual exploits rather than the murders. There was never any evidence to tie her to the crimes, and no other suspect was considered. The detective work was shoddy, the police were prejudiced, and the witnesses unreliable. And what I said earlier, compare that to today. If that was the case today, I don't think she would have been found guilty. But then again, the father was at work, she was at home. Who else could have done it? Detective Peering, he said that when he went into one of the bedrooms, the kids' bedrooms, the window was closed. There was dust by the windowsill. There were no fingerprints or footmarks or anything of that nature. Because if somebody came and took the child, you would have seen it. But of course, he could never present this evidence because the Muppet didn't take any pictures. Eventually, Eddie himself died in 1998. Alice moved to Florida. Who knows where she is today? Body eaten by rats. I do believe she's guilty. Of course, there's no other explanation. But could they prove it? Comment, tell me what you think.